On our episode today, I have Michael Kaminsky, the co-founder at Recast. He's super smart, really, just always blows my mind whenever I get a chance to talk to him. I'm so excited to have you here. Thanks for joining us, man.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Let's start from the beginning. So tell us more about who you are, what you do, how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, so I'm Michael. My background actually is in econometrics. So I studied economics and econometrics in school, did a bunch of like academic type research, understanding price elasticity in terms of responses to changes in the price of water in desert cities. I then moved into healthcare. I did a lot of what's called healthcare outcomes research. So trying to understand the comparative effectiveness of different, health treatment interventions, right? Does treatment A or does treatment B lead to better or worse outcomes over time? Did a lot of work using observational data. So looking at like records of insurance claims to try to understand, okay, in these different populations, how do different interventions yield different types of outcomes? I did a bunch of work in clinical trial. So all of my background is, doing econometrics and really, I think about it as doing science, right? Trying to understand what are the causal mechanisms actually at work in the world and how can we use that to help people. Over the last 10 or 15 years, basically what I've done is I've tried to take all of those methods that I worked on in healthcare and in academia and apply them to marketing science, right? How can we do that same work in the world of marketing to understand what really works, what doesn't, how can we help brands grow?
It's so funny. So when I went to school, I have an econ degree as well, and my favorite class was econometrics because the teacher first comes into the class and goes, "This is going to be one of your hardest classes, but at the end of this, you'll be able to tell the future." And I was like, "All right, I'm on board with this."
What a great start to a class! That is
right?
amazing.
and he's not wrong, right? Like that is the beauty of the work that we do, and it's interesting because digital marketing, AI, all of this have just created a whole additional set of data that we can work with and that we can use. And I love that. That's kind of where Recast is. That's what you guys do. So I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about measurement because you are the measurement guy. So let's start with how should a consumer brand just be measuring paid media? That's always the number one question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And there's sort of the easy answer, which isn't very helpful. And then there's maybe like more detailed, slightly more helpful answers. But I'll start with the easy answer, which is you should be thinking about incrementality, which is to say every brand should be focused on if I spend an additional $1,000 on media in some channel, how much additional revenue is that getting us beyond what would have happened anyway? And it's the beyond what would have happened anyway that's actually the tricky part that a lot of brands miss, because it is very easy in the world of marketing measurement to confuse correlation and causation or make the post-hook fallacy, which is to say confuse that just because something came after something else means it was caused by that thing. And so incrementality is the thing, causality is the thing. How much additional revenue are you generating? That's the important thing to be focused on. Now, how do you actually achieve that is going to vary depending on where you are in the life cycle of your business. Newer, small brands, really doing touch-based attribution, right? So if you're like a D2C company, direct to consumer, no one's ever heard of you before, your touch-based attribution, last touch attribution, even what shows up in the Meta ads reporting platform is actually going to be very close to incrementality, right? No one else has heard of you. Your purchases without advertising are going to be zero because no one's heard of you. You're very small. And so that gets you very close to incrementality. But as brands get more complex and get bigger, that gets harder. You actually start to have a brand. You have more customers that have heard of you, maybe that have heard of you from other customers. You are advertising in more channels. And so just because someone saw an ad on Facebook doesn't mean that that ad caused that purchase, because they might have also seen you on TikTok. And so now you have a lot more complexity that you have to start managing as you are thinking about, okay, how can we optimally allocate our marketing budget? And so I think the thing, if you're a marketer or you're a CEO of one of these companies, what you want to be always thinking about is how close or how far away are the metrics that I'm looking at from true incrementality, true causality. That is the thing to keep your eye on so that you don't end up getting confused because this thing that used to work when you were small doesn't really work anymore now that you've gotten bigger and are more complex.
Can we help people just frame what small is? I guess in your mind, when you're talking about small, media spend, revenue size, what are the metrics you're looking at to define, small, medium, large?
Oh, it's so hard. I mean, it varies by geography, but like in the US,
Yeah.
right, when I'm thinking about small, I'm thinking, you know, like $1-2 million of paid media spend per year, I would still
Mhm.
consider as small, right? That
Yeah.
amount of media spend, you're probably really only on 1 or 2 marketing channels. Generally, that's going to be a paid search, Google effectively, and a Meta. And if you are thinking about expanding to more channels when you're still at that level of spend, it's really like actually you need to be focusing on either your creative or your product or your pricing or something that's going to allow you to get to more scale just on those 2 channels. Once you're in the 4, 5, $10 million of paid media spend, that's when things start to get more complex and you need to add more complexity into your marketing measurement stack to really make sure that you're optimizing against true incrementality.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so help me understand how incrementality versus MMM, where do they fit in? How do they work together? What's the
Yeah.
difference?
So just to be super clear, when I say incrementality, I just mean causality. And there's no like incrementality versus MMM. All marketing measurement approaches should be judged to the extent that they capture true incrementality or not. And the important thing to know is that there is no measurement method that can fully capture true incrementality. True
Right.
incrementality is a thing. There is a true relationship between the $1,000 that you invest in Meta and how much additional revenue that drives for your business or additional profit that drives for your business.
Yeah.
But we humans do not have access to that number. That the
Yeah.
true incrementality is unknown and unknowable. There's nowhere that we can look it up. We do not have access to it. All that we can see are sort of, the shadows that true
Yeah.
incrementality
Yeah.
casts on the wall in front of us. And so there are times, again, as I mentioned, when digital tracking last attribution might be very close to true incrementality. There might be times when it's far away. Experimentation, this is a thing that a lot of people are talking about. Experimentation, controlled experiments, lift tests, and they just use the word incrementality, but that actually gets things confused. And so I think it's important to be very careful here. In certain situations, controlled experiments can help us approach measuring incrementality, but not always. And also, it's important to understand that experiments are often noisy measures of true incrementality.
Yeah.
Media mix modeling is another way of trying to measure true incrementality. They're often wrong, and so often they
Yeah.
don't measure true incrementality. But the idea is that digital tracking, touch-based attribution, experiments, and MMM should all be helping us try to measure true incrementality. And as we are thinking about when to use which measurement method or how to evaluate how well it's working, what we should be thinking about is how well is this thing capturing true incrementality, the thing that we actually care about.
It's fascinating because I find it I love that you and I are sitting here talking math and feeling as if and the sense is that to everyone else that you should have a really clear understanding of I have an ad, it did this and this was my output, right? And that is just inherently not how advertising works. And in economics, you learn that you are trying to measure a human behavior, and so what worked today will never work tomorrow, or will not happen. And so, I love that people are starting to get comfortable with the uncomfortable again, which is what we used to do when we first started on marketing. And then, performance media made everyone have this false sense of security. And now we're back into, oh, wait, actually, I don't think we're measuring things right. And we need to rethink all of this. And so now being back into this world of triangulation, right, where you are not trying to know for certain what happened, but at least have a sense of where to go.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And I don't know to what extent people are actually getting uncomfortable with uncertainty, but it's a thing that I think needs to happen, is really sort of embracing this idea that, look, we can't know everything. There are certain things that we cannot know for certain. And we just have to think about what is the best that we can do and what is the return on getting additional precision or learning additional things. And those are much harder questions. They're much more sophisticated ways of thinking about different types of analyses that we might do, but that's actually like really critically important, especially for brands that want to get to that next scale, right? If your only dream is like, look, we're going to be a small brand, we're going to stay on Facebook and Google, and we're going to capture the profit that we can from there. That's totally reasonable. And it's like great, honestly, I think for a lot of brands. But for those brands that want to make it to that next level, to get into the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, you have to get more sophisticated in how you think about operating the business.
Yeah, we have a thesis on, even for some of our smaller brands that are spending $2 or $3 million in media, of not only being on Google and Meta and like diversifying early on, just because of the risk, right? So when we are, even if there is opportunity on Meta to continue to scale, we'll try and find additional channels first and try and scale into them, because your Meta account gets paused for a weekend, you're out. Like Google got paused for a handful of clients over the weekend, and they were out thousands and thousands of dollars. And so adding some operational risk for some diversity is worthwhile, and I'd recommend that to a lot of people. I am curious, do you have a framework by which you recommend people think about it? How do you put an MTA? When do you do MTA? When do you start doing incrementality lift tests? And how often are you doing that? And then how do you ultimately come to a recast for MMM?
Yeah. So MTA, I think, is really interesting. There are a lot of very smart people that disagree with me on this. So, if you're thinking about this, definitely feel free to get a second opinion. But my belief is that if you're going to do a digital tracking based approach, you get most of the value by doing the following. Have a report that shows you last touch attribution, have a report that shows you first touch attribution, and have a report that shows the ROI or the CPA implied by some post-checkout survey. If you have those three things and you can sort of look at them all in one place, regularly updating, that gets you like 90% of the value that any touch-based attribution is possibly going to get you. Multi-touch attribution of like being like, oh, we're going to weight the middle touch and the second to last touch in different ways, I just don't think adds that much beyond what you get from being able to look at first touch, last touch, and post-checkout survey. So my recommendation in general is that if you're, once you're spending really any serious amount of money on advertising, you should get something like that set up so that you can keep an eye on your first touch, last touch, and post-checkout survey. None of those is like correct, right? They will be different numbers. But to the extent that they are different, that should raise interesting questions for you as a business and give you ideas for things about how is our marketing actually working. Maybe you'll see that some channels look better at first touch, other channels look better at last touch. That might sort of imply things about like, oh, look, like they're operating at different parts of the funnel depending on what our strategy is. We might want to, and like those sorts of questions and discussions that report provokes, I think are really healthy and very, very good for your business. And again, you'll have to sort of manage the business by feel, but as long as you have that report updating frequently, you'll be in a very good spot. Same idea with the post-checkout
only
survey.
One column I'm going to add to that: platform attributed. Just
platform attributed also
great. Yeah. Just
again, none of them are right. Right? Again, people always ask me like, I look at these four columns, which one's the right one? And I'm like, they're all right and they're all wrong. Like that's
whichever one you want for that day is the right one.
But I mean, really the idea again is this idea of triangulation, right? You need all of those different data points. They're measuring slightly different things, but that goes a really, really long way. And is a really good starting place, to base your business. After that, the thing that I start to recommend is starting to build the experimentation muscle. And so this is a place where what you want to do is really start to pressure test how close or far away those different metrics are from something like true incrementality. And so experimenting with either running conversion lift studies via the platforms themselves, like both Meta and Google have conversion lift studies that you can run in the platform. I think it's limited based on how much you spend, so you might need to talk to your rep to find out if you qualify. But run that, look at the numbers, put them in a fifth column, right? And start to compare and start to think about how close or how far away are they from the other things. Start to build that muscle so that your business starts to understand incrementality. For people who haven't done this before, what I often recommend as a first experiment is run an incrementality experiment with something like branded search, right? So you can do a geo lift test where you turn off branded search in certain geographies and then see how well does the results of that experiment line up with what you are measuring. And probably what will happen is that your last touch attribution will be way over crediting branded search versus what is truly incremental. Maybe not, right? Again, this varies for different brands, but this is often a thing that happens. And that helps, again, just to spur really interesting and helpful conversations internally, right? Really break, sometimes the CEO or the finance team can get obsessed with last touch attribution and think that that's actually a causal relationship when it's really not. And so running that first experiment and being able to show people, look, we turned off branded search in these states and we saw that revenue didn't change at all. That is a light bulb moment for a lot of people who are not really deep into marketing analytics and marketing measurement. And that can be a really helpful way to start, again, having these more productive conversations about the thing we care about, incrementality and causality, and how that's different from any of these potential reports that we're looking at. So build the experimentation muscle, try to focus on the most high impact experiments that you can run. Where do we have doubts? Where are the biggest differences between first and last touch attribution, or the biggest differences with post checkout survey? Can we run an experiment that helps us narrow in on which one of those might actually be closer to true incrementality? Get the organization used to thinking that way. And that then starts to build a really nice base of understanding in the organization, the right way of thinking about marketing. And then from there, you can start adding on more complex methods like doing an MMM, when you have a more complex media mix, when you have forecasting problems that you need to solve. That's where you start to pull all of these different disparate threads together.
Yeah, I would almost say, I would tell people, one, we've run brand search holdout groups pretty often. It ends up being incremental in a lot of unique ways. If you're in a highly competitive market, if you've got Amazon as a wholesaler, if you're running on retail, all of those times you don't realize how much you lose to branded search. And so we recommend run the incrementality test, have an understanding of, run an incrementality test. The issue with incrementality test is it doesn't account for time. So an incrementality test when you're running sale versus when you're not running sale will have very different outputs. And so definitely keep that in mind as you're running incrementality tests. The other
the other thing that I note is not only when it's on sale or not, but even just seasonality. Right. Again, that can change. If you're selling sunscreen, the test that you run in the winter is probably going to yield different results than the test that you run in the summer. And so you need to keep that in mind. So there's timing effects of how long does it take for people to purchase? There's promotional effects. There's also seasonality. And so lots of good reasons why you can't just say, oh, we ran one experiment one time and now that's the answer forever. It unfortunately just doesn't work.
Oh man. And if you've run MMM before and you see your seasonality is very high, run incrementality tests throughout those periods to really understand, okay, while seasonality is high, what about my media spends? If I keep this variable flat, what happens? And so, I think that's really valuable. And then just in terms of conversations with CFOs who absolutely, for whatever reason, double down on last click always, right? And it is, so if I were to think about the columns, I would prioritize channels that have high first touch or high attributed and low last click, and just prove out the value of. Michael, you got my brain turning in that I'd love to just have a report that indexes all of it. Even if you just give everything even weight and just index the whole thing, it gives you a better understanding of, okay, how are my channels and campaigns performing against one another? But yeah, I think having a good framework for measurement is really important, and this concept of getting people to get their muscle on incrementality lift tests. So, brand lift test, revenue lift test, both of those are really important. But Michael, I've run tests, I've got some baseline data. How do I go to when and why do I start to invest in MMM?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So I think there's been a lot of hype around media mix modeling over the last couple of years. And I think we're starting to come down off the hype because there was a bunch of hype and people talked about it and everyone this is the solution to measurement. We don't need anything else. And then a bunch of people tried it and we're oh wait, this does not live up to my expectations, which is good. I think that's healthy, right? That's a good part of the cycle. But Basically, so media mix modeling, what is it, right? It's a top-down statistical model. And so what you're doing is you're looking at aggregate data, and you have some statistical, econometric, or machine learning algorithm that's trying to find the patterns in that historical aggregate data. So nothing user level is being looked at. It's just looking at, hey, look, we have this pattern of marketing spend over the last couple of years. We have pattern of sales over the last couple of years. Try to find the relationship between those variables. That's what we're doing. These models are very complex. And they're very complex, meaning that they have, what that means practically is that there's lots of assumptions. There's lots of assumptions about, okay, what are the, how are the time shifts going to work? When we spend money, how does that get spread out over time? What does the saturation curve or the diminishing marginal return curve look like? Lots and lots and lots of different assumptions. And the problem is that any of those assumptions could be wrong. And to the extent that any assumption is wrong, it could potentially invalidate all of the results coming out of the model. And so that amount of complexity makes it so that it is it's a tool that is very easy to get wrong, and therefore requires a fair amount of investment in order to get it right and make sure that it's right for your business. And so I don't recommend that you just jump in and say, hey, yeah, we're just going to do this, because it's hard, right? And so you need to embrace that there's going to be some work to really get it working and get it working correctly. Why would you use a media mix model? So I think media mix models start to become valuable as you have more and more different marketing channels. And that's partly because it's just difficult to run as many experiments as you would like. If you're in 3 marketing channels, it's pretty easy to build an experimentation schedule where it's like, okay, we're going to test all 3 of these, every 3rd or 4th month. We'll be able to test them throughout the year. We're going to feel really good about our ability to run enough experiments to keep track of what's going on in those different channels. When you have 20 different marketing channels, that all of a sudden is a lot more complicated, right? Your experimentation schedule is a lot more complicated. Some of those channels you cannot construct a controlled experiment for them. Something like podcast, right? That's not easily addressable. Linear TV, for a bunch of different reasons, it's very difficult to actually experiment with. And so those problems start to add up, and they make it so actually we're only able to test every channel once a year and only our big ones. And so some of the other channels just never get experimented with. And we have a bunch of problems where we need to be able to forecast the business, right? We need to be able to, we're a public company. We need to be able to make a forecast for how much, with this marketing budget, what do we think we're going to be able to return? We need to be able to do that accurately. We need to be able to do different scenarios.
I think that is the reason why Last Click still exists and why CFOs like Last Click, is because it makes it really easy to forecast.
Well, so here's the deal. It makes it really easy to build a forecast by dragging things across. Yes. But making an accurate forecast, it actually makes it worse. And that is the problem.
Yes. Fair.
And so CFOs like it because they just drag the numbers across. Unfortunately, once you actually start doing that and comparing the actual results to your forecasted results, they end up diverging a lot, especially again, once you're a larger company with a more complex media mix. So that's a core problem. And so the businesses for whom a media mix model makes sense, they tend to be more complex. They have these problems, operational problems around forecasting, doing budget optimization, doing scenario analysis. And that's where the value of a media mix model really starts to shine above and beyond just trying to run as many experiments as you can.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think to your point at the beginning of this around media mix modeling is people, when they hear is expensive to build and manage, it's not only there are tech fees and tech costs against it, and they're not in the grand scheme of things, the tech costs are not the problem. It's the resourcing, it's the historical data, it's going back in time and being all right, we're going to launch MMM for the first time. Let's gather 3 years of data and what exists and what, when did we run a promotion? That, it's how many catalog did we run? Yeah.
We have to educate the CFO. We have to explain why these numbers are different from the last touch attribution. The CFO is going to be skeptical. We have to plan for validating to be able to prove that it's actually all of that work is it's a lot of headache. And again, it can be worth it. I run a media mix modeling company, we do this. But again, it's I would say make sure that the juice is going to be worth the squeeze. You have to be at a stage of business where you're going to get a lot of return in order for that investment to be worth it. Because otherwise it's going to be oh man, we've got to go hire 2 people to think about it, to analyze it's just it starts to add up to be a lot of internal effort. And the question should be like, well, should we do that? Or should we just like hire someone who's really good at making video creative so that we can start to launch experiments on YouTube? And like, and for a lot of companies, like hiring the person that's really good at YouTube creative is going to be a better ROI than trying to like really fine tune your measurement on Facebook when it's like, well, actually just try to run more conversion lift studies and that'll get you 90% of the way there.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to measurement, I'm always, just because you can measure it doesn't mean you should measure it is a really important piece. And, for us, when we look at marketing mix modeling, when we tell our clients it's time for an MMM tool, it's because we're really trying to understand less about the media and more about the outside forces. So how much impact does seasonality have? What is Black Friday, Cyber Monday's true incremental lift for us? When we run a promotion, what should that promotion be? What is the impact of one channel on another? Because it allows us strategically to say, hey, I know you want to give us that extra $1 million, but you should go do a catalog with it because we actually see better impact on our performance channels when you run a catalog. So it's when you're starting to answer, I think that this is the part where people have kind of lost the thread on measurement. Is it's not to prove the value of your media, it's to build a strategic perspective on your media and your marketing. And so when you have that point of view, it shifts the question around when should I invest in this? Not to prove to my CFO that this advertising is worth it, but advertising drives like 50% of the total revenue for a business for most of the time. Like it's obviously worth it. Just the question is, what are you doing to optimize that resource and where are you getting the best bang for your buck? And from my perspective, that's when people should start to look at this. It's when your tools start to stop working. I mean, to give us an analogy, like when do you buy a hammer? When your screwdriver isn't heavy enough. And it's like, that's like pretty much the same perspective here, right?
Yeah. And I think that's exactly right. Like helping think through these larger strategic decisions is exactly right. And yeah, it's just a thing. It's not a magic. It's not magic beans. It's not a magic bullet. Like you have to keep that in mind. Like it's going to have its own problems. It's not the magic solution to incrementality that I think some people have pitched it as. And so it's really, really important that you make sure that you're thinking hard about like, okay, what are we actually going to use it for? What are the drawbacks going to be? How are we going to overcome those? Is it going to be worth it? And then at that point, it's like, okay, yes, like this, let's evaluate if this actually makes sense for us as a business.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I know, Michael, we're coming up on time. So there is one question I have been like itching to ask you. And it is this thing that has started, people have started talking about and something that's been top of mind for me too, around this concept of an inferred MMM versus causal MMM, because we talked causation versus correlation, and same thing in MMM is an economic model. We're just looking at what happened. So can you help educate me on what the difference is and when and how I should be thinking about that kind of as we move forward?
So yeah, interesting topic. Again, I'm going to have maybe a slightly spicy take. My belief is that every media mix model should be causal. If it is not causal, I would say, what are you even doing? Like that seems like a waste of time.
Yeah.
The reason why, a couple of reasons why. So first of all, like again, what I said at the beginning is that every marketing measurement strategy should be judged based on how well it approaches incrementality, where incrementality is also just another word for causality. So incremental, causal, that's the whole point of everything that we're doing. Any measurement methodology that we don't think is helping us get closer to incrementality or causality, I think is, should be thrown out, right? It's not helping us make the decision that we care about as a business. Because what do we care about as a business? We care about being able to optimize our marketing budget, which means we have to understand the relationship between the levers that we have, investment in different marketing channels, the outcome that we care about, profit, revenue, new customers, whatever. That means understanding causality, understanding incrementality. Those are the same thing. So the whole point of doing it in MMM should be to understand incrementality, should be to understand causality. If you're not doing that, I think you're wasting your time. So that's like the overall view. So why are people talking about this? I think there's a couple of things going on here. So unfortunately, I think a lot of media mix modeling vendors historically have tried to obfuscate what they're actually doing. And so the models in general, again, media mix modeling, very hard for lots of different reasons. Very hard to get a good result. But people have been selling media mix models for a very long time. And unfortunately, they've been selling bad media mix models for a very long time. And so in order to avoid being judged the right way on how well does this model actually predict the future, on how well does this line up with outside of experiments, some vendors or modelers have said, oh, no, you can't judge it this way. This is only looking backwards, so anything that happens in the future, doesn't apply, and we can't look at it. And again, I would say that that's a cop-out. That's, you as a modeler saying you have a bad model because it cannot be judged outside of the modeling framework itself. If you're talking to anyone who makes a claim like that, I think you should just be super skeptical. And so people are talking about causal MMMs. We talk about it a lot, but the point should be that every MMM should be causal, and you should be able to use the tools of causal inference, experimentation, controlled experiments, quasi-experiments, to evaluate how well your MMM actually is, approaching causality, approaching incrementality. And so I do think that every MMM should work this way. Anyone who has an MMM that says, oh, don't judge it based on causality or based on incrementality, I think is trying to obfuscate something. They don't want their model to be judged the right way, probably because it falls short.
Yeah, it's interesting because it goes back to the question around, am I doing this to prove out value or to build future expectations? And so like having a MMM model that allows you to be confident in how we're actually going to be investing in the future is all that actually matters to me, right? Like I don't need to prove out what already happened. I can just look at the P&L. And it's like, so yeah, I hear you on that. How does somebody determine if their MMM is causal or just for backwards?
Yeah, so this is I think the thing that is tricky, and that I encourage everyone to spend a lot more time thinking about. So the trick, and I alluded to this earlier, the problem with media mix models is that they're very complex, which means that there's a lot of assumptions. Also, what it means is that for any given media mix model, you generally have different combinations of parameters that all fit the data equally well, right? And so if you've run Robin, you've probably seen that Robin is an open source media mix modeling package. You've probably seen this. Like what Robin does is it just produces like 50 different models, and it says, all of these fit the data equally well, you choose.
You choose.
Which I think, sort of defeats the purpose, but that's how that framework works. And it's also true of many other modeling approaches. You can make very small minor decisions that will totally impact the output of the model, its estimate of causality, and they all fit the data equally well. And so when it comes to media mix modeling, the challenge is not just training the model, right? That's very easy. The challenge is, how do we validate it? Which of those 50 is actually right? Like model number 1 and model number 50, totally inconsistent. They say totally different things about how our marketing program is working. They fit the data equally well. How do we know which one is actually more correct or less correct? And this is the place where you need to use the tools of causal inference, right, in order to validate the model. And so there's two main tools that I recommend that people look at for using. So one is corroborating the model or the results of the model with outside experiments. And so those experiments could be controlled trials, so like a conversion lift study on Meta, or a GeoLift structured experiment, or even a quasi-experiment, right? So you can say, hey, look, the model says that branded search has an incremental ROI of 2x. Great. Let's turn off branded search for 2 weeks and see how much revenue drops. And we should be able to say, like, it drops in line with what the model predicted, or it doesn't drop in line with what the model predicted. Similarly, the model says that TV has a 5x ROI. Okay, great. Next quarter, we're going to spend up on TV, and we're going to see, do we get more revenue in line with what the model predicts? And these aren't going to be perfect measures, right? There's going to be uncertainty, but you should be able to say, like, in general, does this line up with what the model is predicting? And so, again, any media mix model should be tested this way. But this is how you evaluate to what extent the model is actually producing causal estimates that match the real world. And it's the most important step. And it's not even like a step. Like, you need to be doing this in an ongoing way as you are using a media mix model. It's not just like we do it one time and the check passes and we're done. We need to keep doing this. And so the thing that we talk about here is actually, like, you shouldn't think about a media mix model in isolation. You should think about building an incrementality system where you are running your media mix model, you are designing experiments, you're validating the media mix model, you're using that to optimize your budget, and then you're repeating this process over and over and over again. It's a thing that's never done. It's a constant way of using the media mix model and running experiments and optimizing your budget all at the same time in this virtuous cycle to do continuous improvement.
It's really interesting because in my mind, uh, the decisions I make on my incrementality testing change then if I have an MMM. Because if I have an MMM tool and I've got 50 models and they all say, all 50 models said Facebook's a 1.8x return, but Google's a 1.2 to a 3x. All right, well, then I want to validate the Google one. I don't need to incrementality test the Facebook one. And now it makes sense why incrementality tests are the first step before an MMM, is because that data set gets added into your MMM tool as previous benchmarks and helps the tool actually identify the right model on the output.
That is exactly correct in theory. But again, devil in the details, not like none of the open source packages, for example, allow you to include multiple different lift tests in the package.
Yeah.
And so it's a thing that sometimes you have to be thoughtful about in terms of how are we going to use these different pieces of evidence that we have in conjunction. But those end up being the hardest questions, right? Of like, I ran the model, it gives this result. I have two other, experiments that we've run in the last 2 years. They're different. What does that mean? And that's the question that you have to be able to answer as an organization as you're going to start going down this path.
I love that. Michael, I could literally talk to you about this stuff forever, and I'm always fascinated by your perspective on it. But before we go, I'd love for you to just tell everybody, what is Recast, where can they learn more about you, all of that kinds of stuff.
Yeah, so Recast, we're building the world's most rigorous incrementality platform, helps companies build this incrementality system that I'm talking about. That includes a tool for doing media mix modeling, also includes a tool for doing geolift. Check out our website, getrecast.com. And then if you are interested in this type of content, follow me on LinkedIn. That's where I publish, deep dives, thoughtful analyses about marketing science, marketing analytics. Don't make it a sales pitch. So if you're interested in this, type of discussion, please follow me there.
I highly recommend it. I learned so much from following him. So thank you, Michael, so much for coming and joining us today.
No, thanks so much for having me. This was a fun conversation.